From CBS 47 and Fox 30, you're watching This Week in the 904.
Welcome to This Week in the 904. I'm your host, Jake Stofan. This is a community affairs show, and we'll focus on politics, public policy, and issues that affect our local communities. Joining us today is Ormond Beach State Senator Tom Leek. Thank you for joining us, Senator. Obviously, session is just ahead. Wanted to jump right into it by asking you, what are your top priorities this year?
You know, I think we've got to look at property tax, and the reason you have to look at property tax is affordability. You know, if you look at what Florida's main issues are going to be in the future, it's going to be affordability, and property tax is one of the key components. So as we move forward, I think you'll see the legislature focus in pretty acutely on property tax.
We've seen a lot of what the House has done so far. I mean, they had like 10 proposals. Some were just kind of let's create a new homestead exemption. You know, there's another one that goes full-blown kind of in what the governor's been calling for, which is total elimination. Do you have a policy preference at this point? Is there any particular idea that stood out to you?
Yeah, you know, the House's approach has been kind of a shotgun approach, or spaghetti on the wall approach, right? Throw it all out there and let's see what sticks. You know, as I look at it, I think you have to do something with property taxes. But really, what we're interested in is containing spending. And so it may be appropriate for us to look, you know, not only at the revenue sources, but also to look at the spending. And I'll tell you, in Colorado, they have something that's a taxpayer bill of rights. But what it does is it says, you know, local government, you can't spend more than your budget last year, plus a factor of the population growth, times another factor, whether it's CPI or inflation, but it limits that spending. And if the government then collects more money than is necessary to fund that budget, they have to return the money to the taxpayer. So I think in addition to looking at the revenue sources, we got to look at the expense side too.
Well, you know, one of the things that we hear time and time again in this is what will replace it, right? You know, there's not a whole lot of people who think that you're going to eliminate property taxes even for, you know, a segment of types of properties or whatever, and governments are going to spend less. So your solution is more, let's maybe reduce property taxes or eliminate them in certain areas, but then carry that along with some sort of restriction on how spending.
On spending, right? Yeah. On local government spending. You know, you look at some of these municipalities, and if you look at the revenue back pre-COVID, you know, and I give you one instance, you know, the revenue has gone up about 43 to 48% over that 5-year period. And population growth is around 3%, you know, pick an inflation number, let's say 3%. But you see how the revenue has so outpaced the population growth, and you're not seeing any more services for that. So really what you want to do is restrain that spending, because, you know, if you give a local government more money, they're going to take it and they're going to spend it. And so I think in addition to focusing on property taxes, we've got to limit spending as well.
So one of the things that the governor's proposing is actually putting, I think it was $300 million, don't quote me on that, into the state budget, especially to backfill fiscally constrained county budgets. Yeah. Because if you take any amount of revenue away from them, it's going to be, you know, bigger proportional impact on their budgets than, you know, say a Miami or a Jacksonville perhaps. What are your thoughts on that? You know, I was having a conversation with Representative Duggan. Maybe I'll bring it up after you address sort of your initial thoughts, but he had kind of a novel solution to this.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing it. And listen, the issue is so complex because in the state of Florida, you know, we are so reliant on property taxes and have been for so long. Ripping them away causes a great deal of, you know, we want to be able to fund the basic services, right? So how do we do it in such a way that is responsible? When it comes to fiscally constrained counties, you know, I've heard one of, you know, solutions is let's propose a, you know, no taxes on any property $500,000 or less. Well, you get into some of these fiscally constrained counties, some of the rural counties, and that basically you've taken away their entire tax base. So I don't know that type of solution works, but I'm interested in all creative solutions to make sure that we can still fund the things. Listen, we all want to have decent roads to drive on. We all want to have basic fire and police services. So we're going to have to figure out how to fund those services if there is no property tax.
Well, I'll throw you a curveball here because Representative Duggan's potential solution is less counties. He went into the history of how we ended up with so many counties. Do you think that kind of potential solution stands a chance in the legislature?
No, I don't. I love Representative Duggan and great respect for him, but probably not. You know, people identify with their county, and if you go in and you tell some person that they can't identify with the county anymore, you can't do that. Now, what I do think you could do is I think it makes a lot of sense for some of the counties with small populations to get together and provide services across a multi-county area, right? That way you're spreading that cost over more people, and it makes more sense. For a county of 15,000 people, it may not make a whole lot of sense to duplicate a bunch of services. But if you combine that county with a bunch of other counties, then it makes sense to have that service spread across all of that population.
So kind of agreements between them to share
interlocal
the cost
agreements.
of trash or
Right.
whatever it may be. As we're talking now, and this is going to be airing later, so I'm looking into the crystal ball a little bit, but the Senate hasn't really put out a formal proposal. The governor has not put out his formal. I'm sure it will be out by the time this airs, but and he's obviously teased kind of what he wants to do. When do you think we will see a Senate proposal? Do you imagine it will be one that all senators get behind and then use that to negotiate with the House, or do you think that we will see multiple proposals come out of the?
Well, I want to make sure I understand the premise of your question. The premise of your question is that all politicians are going to agree, because if that's the premise, I don't think that's going to happen. But what I do think is that the Senate will continue to work with the governor to make sure that what we're coming out with is something that the governor approves of, that we approve of, and ultimately the House is going to approve of. But I do think that has to be a coordinated effort.
Well, Senator Leek, we got to take a break here, but coming up, we're going to be speaking with Senator Leek on another big issue that we may see this session or possibly in a special session, as the governor has teased. Mid-decade redistricting. Will bring you his expertise as he led the last redistricting effort in the House.
From CBS 47 and Fox 30, you're watching This Week in the 904.
We're back on This Week in the 904 with State Senator Tom Leek. And Senator, when you were in the House, redistricting, that's the premise for this entire segment. It's something that we're seeing happen all across the country. The governor said he wants to see it here in Florida. Mid-decade redistricting, that is. Obviously, the House has already kind of started this process a little bit at this point. You led the redistricting effort back in, what was that, 2021?
2020, yeah.
2020, 2021, something like that. First of all, I mean, how astronomical of an undertaking is this?
Yeah, I got to tell you, as the chair of redistricting for the House, it is one of the most complex and difficult tasks that the legislature is given, because a lot of the legal components seem contradictory, but you have to work them through, and there are different tiers of consideration. So it's not easy. It's going to take a great deal of work. As I understand it, will be focused strictly on congressional redistricting, and I understand that it's warranted. Even going through it back then, you could look at it and say, okay, I'm not sure that these numbers are correct, but you're bound constitutionally by the numbers that you're given. So I'm not sure that these numbers are correct, and the process. There was just such tension within the process of coming up with the districts, as far as tension in the law. It just seems contradictory in some aspects, that it was often difficult to resolve. But it's got to get done. I think it will get done. And one of the things that's pushing it is the rules are changing. You got to stay within the rules. The rules that we had before, I think, are changing. We'll know more after the Supreme Court rules.
When you were undertaking redistricting, the governor was heavily involved in that process.
Yeah.
I mean, the legislature came out with their map, and the governor vetoed it and said, no, here's the map I want you to pass. Do you imagine, in this second iteration, that we will see that same level of involvement from the executive branch, or do you think everyone's kind of in alignment, they want to get to the same place?
I hope we have the same level of involvement. I expect we will. That is precisely how the process is set to work. The governor has the ability to veto. He has the ability to veto so that he can weigh in on it. Now, I will tell you that the idea that the governor gave some maps and the legislature passed them is not accurate. Right? There are a lot of discussions that take place in getting those maps in a place that work for everybody. And what the end result was the maps that the governor was going to approve and that the legislature approved. So I think you'll see that collaborative process again. I hope the governor is involved, and quite frankly, I have every expectation that he will be involved. And quite frankly, I hope that I'm not the chair.
Well, as you remember, during that redistricting process, I mean, Northeast Florida was really kind of the main attraction, if you will, getting rid of CD5, creating the new CD4. Obviously the district that ran from Tallahassee
Sure.
over to Jacksonville, now it's all kind of condensed into Northeast Florida. Do you imagine Northeast Florida will play as big of a role, if you will, in this effort? I mean, it's kind of, I don't know how, unless you created extra district in Northeast Florida.
Yeah, I don't know. So the thing about redistricting is you follow the population. First and foremost, you look at the number, you see where the concentration of population is, and you'll see growth all across Florida, but the growth doesn't come at an even pace. So if you look at the Panhandle is growing, but not at the same rate that Central Florida is growing, not at the same rate that Northeast Florida is growing. So I always talk about it, it's like imagine a comforter on a bed where you take and, same size comforter, but if you squeeze here, right, it moves stuff from the other places. That's kind of like redistricting and how you draw the districts. If you have a population, you got to squeeze here, you get a more compact district, and it makes the others expand. So it'll follow the population growth as it is throughout the state and the changes that have made. But also if the court changes the rules, and as I understand it, the court is looking at whether it is constitutional to draw districts based on race, right? And the prior rules, that was a protected district. The question is whether those districts can be protected. Now, where do we have those? In Northeast Florida, we don't really have those anymore. You do have a fair amount of them in Southeast Florida, right? You get a little bit in Central Florida. So if race is not a consideration in drawing the lines anymore, I would expect that to have more of an impact on Southeast Florida than on Northeast Florida.
And not just not a consideration, but not allowed to be a
Correct.
consideration.
I mean,
right?
it's a new rule. It wasn't the state of the law before. It may be the state of the law after the Supreme Court rules, but the Supreme Court could obviously overturn that as well, which will require us to go in and redraw the districts.
And the other layer in this is because you obviously have the federal rules, the judicial precedent from the U.S. Supreme Court, but then you also have the state rules, the state U.S. Constitution, the Fair Districting Acts, and when you're looking around the nation, whether it's a red state or a blue state, everybody seems to be trying to draw the lines to favor their party. I mean, the fate of the power in the U.S. House is kind of at stake here, but in Florida,
expressly
lawmakers
unconstitutional.
have
right?
to be very, very careful about the way you talk about it, about the way you draw these, and the way you look at it. I mean, how difficult does that make?
So that in Florida, that would be expressly unconstitutional. You can't draw a district to favor or disfavor a party. And the reason why it's so important that you stick to the rules is because where the legislature has been found to have done that in the past, the courts came in and drew the districts. And there's no constituent out there, no Republican, probably no Democrat out there that wants the courts drawing those districts. You want to keep that within the legislature.
And I mean, with that restriction, is it even worthwhile trying to redistrict, mid-century? You got maps that, seem to be working out pretty well for the GOP. If you can't look at political party, it seems like it would make it tough.
Sure. I mean, you got to do what's right. If the rules change, then you've got to draft legislation in districts that comply with the rules. So it's absolutely worth it, absolutely necessary. And hey, you may know the number now. I should know it as I sit here, but the state of Florida, Republicans are so much more prevalent now than they were 10 years ago in the registrations, right? That necessarily the districts are going to be more Republican because there are more Republicans. So if you look at the registrations, and I think I think Republicans are up by over 1 million in registrations now. Democrats are down by some number I quite frankly can't remember. But if you look at that, necessarily the districts that we draw in the state of Florida are going to be more Republican. It's just statistics.
Yeah. Well, Senator Leek, we got to take one more break here, but don't go anywhere because coming up, we're going to talk about one of the more perhaps fun issues of session, and that would be talking about protecting pets and cracking down on animal cruelty. We'll get his thoughts on a slate of legislation that the governor is backing this year to protect our furry friends.
From CBS 47 and Fox 30, you're watching This Week in the 904.
We're back on This Week in the 904 with State Senator Tom Leek. And Senator Leek, I think the first time that we ever spoke was probably back in 2017, 2018 when I first started covering the legislature. And it was you sponsoring a bill called Ponce's Law. And I remember, your passion on that topic back then, and then in succeeding years, with additional animal protection legislation that you filed. Bring me back, Ponce's Law, I think, was your first. So, was that kind of the trigger that got you into caring about this topic?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I love my dog, I love my puppy. I'm in. I'm always in. Ponce's Law in particular was a horrific situation from which one of the greatest stories about a bill came out. Just briefly, and I'm not going to try to make anybody cry, although I tell you, when I presented Ponce's Law for the first time, I presented to a committee of, I think, 18 people at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and I told the story of Ponce, and Ponce was a beaten dog, and how Ponce died. And I looked up at the dais, and you could see up there, people starting to turn their heads and cry a little bit, and it's like, oh, this one's really struck a nerve. But the great thing about the evolution of Ponce's Law is how it came about. Ponce's Law came from a constituent. There were no Tallahassee interests. There are no lobbyists, but a constituent said, "Hey, this isn't right." And essentially, at that point in time, the penalties for beating a dog to death were the same as prying off a VIN number plate from your car. I mean, it was wrong. But it originated with a constituent, and then we started to work the bill through the process, and it didn't go as smoothly as I expected it. I thought, once I presented it, I thought it would move through pretty quickly, but there are varying views on it at that point in time. But think about this. So it originates with a constituent. It goes through the House. It goes through the Senate, gets on the governor's desk, and the bill ends with the governor of the state of Florida, Rick Scott, coming to Ponce Inlet, the first time any governor's ever visited Ponce Inlet, to sign the bill. I mean, that's how it should work. I mean, the ideas for the legislation should bubble up through the constituents, should work its way through the process. And how cool is it that you get the governor to come to the village of Ponce Inlet?
Well, and that bill, raised penalties for aggravated animal abuse, right?
That's right.
And then, in further sessions, we've seen lawmakers take further steps. Dexter's Law was last year, right?
Yeah.
That also tweaked some of the criminal statutes, but more importantly, it created a system because, you had this situation where somebody could beat a dog to death, get off, go to the animal shelter, get another dog, rinse, recycle, repeat.
Right.
And there was no way of ensuring that person would not have access to animals. And that's kind of what Dexter's Law was all about.
Yeah, so Ponce's Law and Dexter's Law actually dovetailed together. Because in Ponce's Law, we said a court could order that you may never own an animal again, right? But if that person left and went to a different county or went to a different place and went to the dog shelter and got a dog, nobody knew. So how do you enforce that if nobody knows? That's the real importance of the database that was created, which I think, quite frankly, in its final form here needs some work still. Yeah. But that's more of a regulatory issue than a legislative issue. But that's one of the things. So you should be able to go. Everybody I know who has ever worked at a dog shelter loves animals, to their heart, right? They want to know that they're not putting that animal in danger. And so if you give them the opportunity to go and search a database to see whether the person who's adopting the animal has been convicted or otherwise pled guilty to some kind of animal abuse, they will take it and they won't sell that dog to that animal or won't sell that cat. For me, it's dogs. So won't sell that dog to that person.
Yeah, talking about that FDLE database, which just launched on January 1st, obviously, I think people were probably expecting it to include a little bit more information. It's just first and last names. I pointed out there was a guy named John Adams, and I said, I don't think that's the founding father. I think we can presume that it's not. Yeah. But, if you're a animal shelter, you look at it, John Smith comes in, well, you're John Smith on the database, and I don't know that you're not the John Smith that's on there. Have you had conversations with FDLE? Are you anticipating that they're going to sort of beef that up in the coming months?
I think they need to, and if legislatively we need to answer it, we will. Right now, I think it's more of an agency issue. FDLE works for the governor's office, right? So the governor can say, hey, this is not sufficient. We need to get this done. I think there are many opportunities to supplement what they've got there so that it is more useful. I mean, right now you can find the name and then you can click and you have to pay for a report, which I don't like either. But you can get all the information that you need, but it should be in a more readily accessible and readable format than it's in today. And honestly, I think FDLE wants to fix it. I think the governor's office wants them to fix it. I think we'll be good.
Well, I mean, the reason we're talking about all this is not just to go through all the history here, but this session we're likely going to see a lot more done in this space, not only dealing with cracking down on puppy mills, but also dealing with things like pet insurance, puppy stores, their return policies, things like that, their guarantees. You haven't signed on any of those bills yet, which I was surprised by, but you said you do anticipate you will probably co-sponsor a lot of these as they move forward.
Yeah, listen, if you're an animal lover, how cool is that? You're going to have a session that there's going to be an emphasis on animal bills, all things that relate to pet ownership. I think that's really cool. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about all the pieces of legislation. I always like to kind of see how, sometimes you sign on to a bill on day one, and day 30 it looks a lot different and you wouldn't have signed on to it. So I always like to let the bills kind of make sure we're in final form before I get behind them. But I'm in support of the premise and the effort of all of these bills. And I intend to fight for each and every one of those causes, and we'll make sure that language stays crisp and sharp.
And with the governor's backing, that's always a big deal, even in that final term here. Well, Senator Leek, we got to sign off here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you stopping by, and best of luck in the upcoming session. I'm sure I'll be covering a lot of your legislation, probably before this even airs. That's all we have time for today. Senator Leek, again, thank you for joining us. And be sure to join us back here on This Week in the 904 next week, same time, same place.
Thanks for watching This Week in the 904.